I know that you're right.
Well, without further ado, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. My name is Joe Bach. I'm the president of the Rutgers Federalist Society. Joining us today, we are proud to have Dr. Christina Hoff Sommers. She's a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, one of the nation's foremost conservative think tanks located in Washington, D.C. The American Enterprise Institute was founded in 1943. It's home to some of the nation's top scholars, including Jonah Goldberg and Newt Gingrich. Now, Dr. Sommers is a former philosophy professor. She taught at Clark University for a number of years. She's written several very popular books, including Who Stole Feminism?, The War Against Boys, and she also wrote a textbook, Vice and Virtue in Everyday Life, that ethics classes in undergraduates throughout the country use. She recently edited The Debate on Women in Science, and she's preparing to write a book on the lost history of conservative feminism. And today, she will be giving us a lecture on college sports and Title IX. Thank you, Dr. Sorry, two more things. We do have a sign-in sheet going around, so if you could all sign in, that'd be great. And following Dr. Hoff Sommers' lecture, we will have a brief question and answer period. Thank you.
You didn't mention I was on Oprah.
She has also appeared on Oprah Winfrey Show and on the Jon Stewart Show.
And he was nice to me. Well, just to give you a little background about myself, I am a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Yes, the premier conservative think tank, in our opinion, at least. And I've been there for about 10 years. Before that, I taught philosophy for many years at Clark University, where I began as a very liberal professor, and I was asked one year to teach feminist philosophy. The chair of my department asked, and this was in the early 90s. I sent away for the textbook, assuming that it would be what was always in philosophy textbooks. This was sort of reasoned opinions on both sides of arguments, and there'd be essays for and against abortion, or of comparable worth, or surrogate motherhood. That was not what I found in these books. They could have been renamed Paranoia 101. They were these elaborate and implausible theories about the capitalist, heteropatriarchal oppression of American women, and they came with these outrageous statistics and twisted, warped view of the world, and it was relentless. Now, it didn't bother me that there was radicalism in these textbooks, but I wanted the counterpoise. Where was the moderate view? Where was the balance? And I couldn't find it. So I began to argue with my colleagues, and in fact, I went to the American Philosophical Association and challenged some of these opinions. And typically, if you go to the American Philosophical Association and you challenge your colleagues, you have arguments and then you get kind of bitter, but then you all go out for drinks. You part as friends. We did not part as friends. We did not go out for drinks. I was excommunicated from the Society of Women in Philosophy because they actually considered it heretical. Now, these were very radical feminists at the time, and I don't know that you would, I think it's changed and it's more moderate these days. However, the groups that I was arguing with at the time, they became quite powerful in the university, and especially the women's organizations, and they get their way. Their worldview prevails in these organizations. And this evening, I'm going to talk about what's happened with Title IX, when bad things happen to good laws. Because originally, and this is the kind of thing I would have debated with my colleagues years ago, is that I consider myself an equity feminist. An equity feminist is someone who wants for women what she wants for everyone: basic fairness, equality of opportunity, equality of dignity. But as an equity feminist, I don't insist that men and women be exactly the same. I don't insist that there be, I want equality of opportunity, but not necessarily equality of outcome. That's, you give people the opportunity, you open the doors, and then if they want to go through, fine. If they don't, that's also their choice. And it's my opinion that men and women don't always make the same choice and how we live our lives and the fields we go into. But my colleagues who were more hardline, and some of them were very hardline, just to give you an example, the first class that I taught in philosophy, in feminist philosophy, I sent away for textbooks, and one of them arrived. It was by Joyce Treblecott from Washington University. And she dedicated the book to the students in my women's studies ovular in the spring of '92. And I hadn't seen the word ovular before, and I was thinking, oh, what is that? I was about to look it up in the dictionary until I realized that she'd made it up. She doesn't like the word seminar because its root word is associated with the very essence of male power, and so she changed it to what she took to be its feminist equivalent. And it was funny, but she wasn't kidding. And so that's the mindset. It's not, they're very serious. And I find it increasingly irrational, and I'm just going to set the Title IX case up as an example of what's gone wrong. Now, the first thing to say is that the Title IX, as it was originally intended by legislators, and beginning with Edith Green, who was a congresswoman from the state of Oregon, the purpose was to open up the doors in education, not only in sports, but in all fields, and give women the same opportunities as men. Title IX was simply an amendment to the education bill that said that you will not discriminate on the basis of gender, and you can't have a program and no women allowed. And Americans, certainly members of Congress, thought it was fair and reasonable, and it passed without much trouble. But over the years, the groups that I talked about, that I was arguing with in the early 90s, as they began to take power and in their organizations, the women's groups that had once been moderate, like the American Association of University Women, the National Women's Law Center, these groups began to adopt a philosophy that it wasn't enough that women had equal opportunity. As I said, they wanted to see proportionality. For example, in sports, as women were increasingly dominant on the campus, 40, 50, 60 now, well, not more than 60, but now it's around 57% of our undergraduates are female. They said, well, that has to be reflected in the number of athletes that you have. If you have 52% female in your school, you should have 52% athletes. Now, again, that was not the intention of the bill. The intention of the bill was to simply offer the opportunities. It wasn't a quota system. It wasn't an enforced parity. But groups, also the Women's Sports Foundation, which is one of the oldest and most prestigious of the women's advocacy groups, it's led by Billie Jean King, they have now produced something they call the Title IX report card. And they go to every school and they give it a grade, like, are you at proportionality? And if someone was here from one of these organizations, she would say to you, oh, we hear all these complaints about how men's teams are being eliminated, and the wrestlers and the gymnasts and the swimmers, they're all complaining. But in fact, even today, there are still more male athletes on campuses. There are very few schools that have achieved proportionality. In fact, in her list, most schools received an F. Or D. There were very, very few that had even passing grades. Now, one other thing I'll tell you before I go a little more deeply into the story. In Washington, D.C., and around, I guess, mostly the Northeast, there are about 112 major women's sort of think tanks, advocacy groups, and they're gathered into a council called the National Council for Research on Women. Now, you haven't heard of them, you don't think about them, but they are, many of these organizations are as big as any of the think tanks in Washington, D.C. They're full of lawyers. They work day and night, and they kind of canvass the environment. They scour it for any place they find where women are falling behind men. Now that makes sense. Why should we say they're women's organizations? But now let me put it into a larger context. Let's just look at the American campus, where, as you probably heard, or even go to high school. If you go to a graduation, far more girls than boys now go to college. Girls are winning most of the honors. If you have a valedictorian, probably the exception is the young men in this room. You were probably honor students, but you would know that many of your friends in your high school, especially if you went to a public high school, the boys are falling behind in ways which are dramatic and worrisome. There is a reading gap, in fact, a literacy gap. It's a chasm. There are just vast numbers of young men who just are not part of the culture of the written word. This is a dangerous situation. They're going to find it very hard to make a place for themselves in a knowledge-based economy. So what we see now is, starting with Title IX and kind of educational revolution that took place where all the doors were open to women, women went through in great numbers and great success. And you now have women getting 57% of the bachelor's degrees, a majority of the master's degrees, and as of 2 years ago, a majority of the PhDs. And there are now fields which were once male-dominated that we find now women are all but taking over. Fields like psychology, veterinary medicine, for some reason, is the field that was once 70–80% male, it's now reversed. And women, it's difficult to get into vet school, but almost as hard. The VCATs is the MCAT, the medical school exam, but these young women are great students, determined, and so all over you're seeing this ascendancy, and it's impressive. And I tell you, as a college teacher, I saw it in my classroom. Increasingly, but what's happened on many of our campuses, especially the small liberal arts colleges, there are far more girls than boys, far more young women than men. However, we've got these women's organizations. We don't have men's organizations, and I'm not even saying we should. But I hope that these women's organizations stop doing what they're doing. Now, let me tell you a little about that. They are relentless. Now, you may have heard about men's teams evaporating on campuses. Just this week, yesterday, there was an announcement that the rugby team and the swimming team at Berkeley were going to be disbanded, or they would lose their varsity status, and they weren't going to be supported by the university. We've seen wrestling, any of the sports which don't produce a great deal of money. If it's football or basketball, those are pretty safe. But any team other than that, and you want to achieve parity in your schools, how do you do it? Now, some schools are wealthy enough that they can just have everybody doing everything, but most schools can't. And what ended up happening is that, suppose that you had on your campus, 57% of your undergraduate enrollment was female, but you were only attracting about 40% of them to your athletic teams. What do you do? And in the end, what happened on many campuses, they just reduced the level of male participation to that of female interest. So if if there were girls on the teams, you got it up. You want to try to get as close to parity as you could. But of course, they just never get there because there's not the same interest among the women as the men. Now, that's not to say that there is no interest. If we all know many, many young women who are fantastic athletes, just as interested, just as obsessed in sports, there just aren't as many. It's just a different pool. The pool of, and we have got a lot of data on this. They'll ask Pew Studies and UCLA every year surveys attitudes of freshmen and how much did you play sports and what per week, and there's a certain percentage of kids that was just kind of obsessed with it, and they tend to be far more male than female. If you look at who subscribes to Sports Illustrated, it's mostly men. And they tried to get a woman's